Hello there, this is James Ascroft, he knows 1978, and as part of the ghost of Watcher Azazel's ongoing quest to haunt me from beyond the grave, as well as to figure out why Blumhouse Productions sucks donkey balls, and why neither he nor the films themselves ever scare me, this year he's made blood drip down the walls of my bedroom until I review the following movies and explain how they affect my opinion of Blumhouse Productions, the philosophy of that company, and the state and future of modern horror films as a whole. This being the case then, if you want to hear the details of my original opinion, concluding that now more than ever, horror, in inverted commas, is sold to cinema goers as an experience, and beyond that single genre as well, all major blockbuster movies are now marketed as events, not as films in themselves, meaning that Jason Blum and all other producers and studios can get away with making disposable and even objectively terrible movies just so long as the marketing makes them look good enough to ensure that enough people pay to see them on opening day. Then the video that I made back when the ghost of Watcher Azazel first began haunting me is linked down in the underbar. But either way though, the 4 films that he's haunted me into reviewing for this Halloween are, in the order in which he linked them to me, Incarnate, which, having started off as Dear Frankie, makes the shift into being The Exorcist meets the poor man's Inception so suddenly that we almost risk whiplash, but then sticks to that well-worn and painfully predictable path like a broken-down old mule. The Belko Experiment, which is simply Battle Royale in an office building, also painfully predictable, except for the absurd and apparently tacked-on ending, which causes it to cross the line from disposable to self-poning. Split, which is another godforsaken butchering of mental health issues, extending the idiot savant trope to the arrogantly patronising pseudoscientific and pseudo-spiritual conceit that mental illness literally gives you superpowers, and has the single most anticlimactic non-twist ending that I've ever seen since the original Wicker Man. And finally, Get Out, which starts off as Guess Who's Coming to Dinner meets the Stepford Wives, subtly demonstrating how far from being eradicated, racism and white supremacy in the US in particular, but definitely not exclusively, have simply evolved into a more polite and socially respectable form, until it suddenly abandons all of that powerful social commentary and draws a premise from Stargate SG-1. Of course, I'll give my full opinion as to why each of these movies fail in a moment after giving a proper spoiler warning, but in the meantime though, while none of the films that the Ghost of Watcher Azazel forced me to review this year were, as I put it 2 years ago in my original Halloween Blumhouse video, the scripts for short student films padded out to feature length, because instead, if these movies are any indication, then Blumhouse Productions appears to be shifting its focus towards quality over quantity, no longer relying on found footage and other cheap movie-making gimmicks to ensure obscene profits, perhaps because the audience is finally getting wise to their scams. The fact that all 4 movies are technically solid based upon full-length scripts and appear to have been produced with decent budgets still doesn't alter the reality that they were marketed as events, not as films in themselves, that in the end, no different from Paranormal Activity or any other Blumhouse film that the Ghost of Watcher Azazel has haunted me until I reviewed, Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice, or the next Star Wars movie, no one in charge of the money gave a flying fig what was in the films themselves, or whether they were good, bad, or indifferent, just so long as they could make them look good enough in the trailers to encourage people to pay to see them on opening day. Full stop. And a year after they're released, no different from the latest meme or viral video here on the internet, no one other than the hardcore fans will ever remember or care that they existed at all. As I suggested 2 years ago, in fact, this is a systemic problem at the very heart of the entire entertainment industry, meaning that the only way to fix it is for us as moviegoers and consumers of entertainment and media in general to demand more from the films and other entertainment and media that we consume than to merely be a part of the event. But returning to the 4 movies that I mentioned a moment ago and making it clear that having already said everything I possibly can about those films without spoiling them, everything beyond this point is nothing but spoilers, so if you don't want to hear them, then there's no reason to stick around any longer. Please click away now, and I hope to see you in another video sometime in the future. Are they gone? Okay. Once we understand and accept the sudden shift from a mother taking her son into hiding to avoid his dad, to that boy suddenly snapping the neck of a homeless woman who up until the previous moment had had superpowers as if she were a chicken, and then after the title screen, the previously unseen protagonist entering what we soon learn is a possessed man's dream to help him escape from the fantasy that the demon, in inverted commas, has concocted in order to keep him docile, and thus drive that demon, in inverted commas, out of his body. Beyond the paint-by-numbers cliches, the defining problem with Incarnate, which ultimately carries it over the line from being a disposable to being a genuinely bad movie, is that the film never establishes precisely why the demon, evil spirit, or whatever we may choose to call it known as Maggie, is so obsessed with the protagonist, to the point at which another demon, or whatever we choose to call it, is presumably willing to kill itself along with its host body, simply to send the protagonist the message that Maggie is waiting for you. In the movie, the protagonist had the power to quote-unquote evict these non-corporeal parasites which Catholics call demons from their human hosts, but chose not to use it and instead to simply live a normal life as a husband and father, until one night out of nowhere, supposedly sensing that he had this power, the non-corporeal parasite known as Maggie possessed a woman so that she could drive her car straight into his, killing his wife and child outright and paralysing him below the waist, and then, just before her host body passed out, said, "I'll torture all that you love." You just killed all that he loved, making torturing them impossible. Seriously, the villain's motivation in this film is a plot hole so massive that it could probably hold Trump's ego, but even if it were possible to simply hand-wave all of that away, from the not-exorcist protagonist losing his faith in God, to the not even slightly dramatic not-shock twist ending, the total absence of anything even approaching originality in this movie is what ultimately condemns it to meaningless mediocrity and meh. Similarly, in the Belko experiment, 80 Americans who work for a fictitious company in the middle of nowhere in Colombia are trapped inside the building and told by a voice over the PA system that they have to kill each other or he will kill them, and not realising that this is a film, ignore him until the backs of people's heads start exploding. So far, so standard. And lo and behold, the man who was established as the protagonist as soon as the shit hits the fan turns out to be the sole survivor. But then utterly undermining the fact that the voice of God, in inverted commas, is a frightening concept precisely because we don't know who he is or why he's ordering them to kill each other, the ending falls apart when the sole survivor is taken by the guards to see the sociologist in charge of this experiment and kills him along with everyone else in the room, after which a shot of the protagonist as he is seen through a CCTV camera pulls back to reveal a bank of other CCTV screens, each showing the sole survivor of the massacre in Belko's 79 other fictitious offices around the world, as a synthesized female voice announces, "End Stage 1, commence Stage 2. Wait, so did every single one of those traumatized and blood-covered people who we see on those screens not only survive the massacres in their own buildings, but also kill the people who are ostensibly in charge of the experiment, including their armed guards, without a single one of them being killed while they were attacking? Or was the protagonist of the film the only one who was taken to see the sociologist? If so, why precisely was he singled out, and why are we now seeing the other survivors on CCTV at exactly the same time? Speaking of which, time zones. Assuming that the CCTV footage is live, how could all of the massacres have taken place at exactly the same time during the day in 80 different countries around the world? Of course, these questions are all rhetorical, but I hope that they serve to demonstrate how by tacking on the scene with the sociologist at the end, instead of cutting straight to the bank of CCTV screens, which in my opinion would have been much more powerful, the film completely sabotages itself, as well as contributes to the dangerous myth that scientists are all amoral monsters. Next up, as I indicated earlier, the film Split is based upon the absurd and utterly laughable insults pulled straight out of M. Night Shyamalan's arse that dissociative identity disorder, what used to be known as multiple personality disorder, unlocks the potential of the human mind and in some cases actually gives you superpowers. Indeed, it is such a grotesque bastardization of the issues involved that I refuse to waste any time whatsoever trying to explain it. However, having introduced a new dimension to the age-old and arse-achingly tedious misrepresentation of DID as a man, a woman, and a child living together in the same body, giving the actor an opportunity to demonstrate their range, I was actually looking forward to the inevitable twist, in inverted commas, in which the abused girl would turn out to have superpowers as well. Wait, did I lose you there? Okay, allow me to back up and explain. In literally the first scene of the movie, it's established that the protagonist has been abused for years, almost certainly, statistically speaking, by a male family member. However, if you're not familiar with the symptoms and warning signs of child abuse, then around half of the film is dedicated to flashbacks showing us the abuse that she's endured, and considering that in M. Night Shyamalan's fantasy world, being abused as a child equals dissociative identity disorder equals superpowers, surely the big twist is going to be that she has developed DID as well, meaning that when the kidnapper's super powerful alternate personality known as the Beast chases her down and traps her after killing all of the other characters, her own super powerful alternate personality will emerge and fight back, right? I mean, why else would they spend half of the film driving home that she was abused, look how much she was abused, right? Wrong! Instead, since the Beast believes that only those who have been purified by abuse as children deserve to live, the moment that he sees her scars, he realises that she is pure as well and lets her go, and the final denouement is that having rescued her, the police are now going to send her back home to her uncle, who we now know to be the real monster. Dun dun dun! Are you kidding me? You're passing off as the massive twist which supposedly defines all movies written and directed by M. Night Shyamalan, the tragically everyday reality that you established in literally the first scene of the film? As I say, the trauma-induced superpowers battle would have been a grotesque and potentially dangerous parody of the issues at hand, further reinforcing the stigma and bigotry against all people with mental illness, and the ghost of Watcher Azazel has even used a Ouija board to tell me that the protagonist developing a super-powerful alternate personality wouldn't have made any logical sense within the context of the film. Oh, the bitterly hilarious irony of appealing to the logic in M. Night Shyamalan's demented bastardization of what little he could be bothered to read on Wikipedia, in which one alternate personality is diabetic while others are not, and simply unlocking the power and potential of the human mind is enough to make another alternate personality bulletproof. Of course, the protagonist suddenly developing a superhuman personality, or another flashback revealing that her superhuman personality had already emerged and killed her uncle would have been contrived, but no more contrived than the rest of this garbage, and at least it would have been entertaining. But instead, we are left with the biggest anticlimax since the bad old days of 1970s horror films, in which the protagonist's efforts were all pointless and or part of evil's plan, and so evil won. The end. However, the fact that this not an ending was indeed almost certainly a shocking revelation for so many people means that I can't dismiss this film entirely. After all, it further serves to demonstrate how utterly ignorant our society remains of the reality of child abuse, specifically the fact that far from the problem being mentally ill kidnappers or men dressing up as women so that they can go into the girl's bathroom, the real threat is almost always someone who the victim knows, and rather than being perpetrated in a dungeon or a van, almost all abuse is carried out in either the victim's or the attacker's own home. That being said, though, the almost literal demonization of DID and mental illness in general, reinforcing the dangerous myth that mental illness makes you a violent monster, still cancels out any social value that this movie may have had otherwise, meaning that in the end, all that we are left with is yet another meaningless string of mediocre and painfully predictable paint-by-numbers cliches built upon harmful stereotypes of people with mental illnesses, held together by a dangerous fantasy and topped off with a bitter anti-climax. And speaking of which, Get Out, the only film on this list that I literally had to stop watching for a while until I had calmed down, because one of the scenes was such an insult to our intelligence that I was literally too enraged to continue, specifically what CinemaSins would describe as the roll credit scene, in which, having temporarily regained control of his own body, the black man who, at that point, we assume had only been brainwashed, repeatedly screams at the protagonist Chris to get out in the desperate attempt to save him, to warn him to escape, to which, of course, everyone in the scene acts as if Chris has just been attacked. Oh God, how could he have attacked you like that? I mean, he obviously wasn't trying to warn you or anything. Okay, I realise that one of the rules of the horror genre is that every character has to be a godforsaken idiot, or at the very least choose to do the stupidest thing possible at that moment, otherwise there wouldn't be a story, and in context, with everyone else being a part of the conspiracy, it was only natural that they would try to allay Chris's suspicions. But seriously though, fuck off! Just how stupid, gullible, and or ignorant do you actually believe we are? On the flip side of that coin, however, Get Out was also the only film on this list with a jump scare that genuinely startled me, specifically the moment when the terrifyingly friendly black housekeeper came up behind the protagonist and said, "Hello." No musical sting informing us that we were supposed to be scared at that moment, just me yelling, "What the fuck?" in perfect sync with Chris as we both recoiled in fear. But at the end of the day though, allowing those two individual moments to cancel each other out, as I indicated earlier, the movie lost all of its impact, meaning and value as far as I'm concerned, when it was revealed that far from simply being brainwashed, the black people brought to this community were now host bodies, with elderly rich white people bidding in what I originally assumed to have been a slave auction to have the cortex of their brain transplanted into the black person's skull as soon as their own cortex had been removed. Like becoming the host of a Goa'uld in Stargate SG-1, the black victims thus being condemned to a nightmarish existence trapped inside their own bodies, able to see and hear, but unable to move or speak, which inevitably raises the question which Chris asks himself of why only black people. Okay, the grandfather had an inferiority complex after being beaten by Jesse Owens in the qualifiers for the 1936 Olympics, thus convincing himself that black men were physically superior, and assuming that he was the founder of the cult who we see in the advert at one point, then his racist philosophy of giving intellectually superior white people the physical advantages of black people would have surely been the foundation of the cult. But if all that the other cult members wanted is younger, stronger, healthier, and what they personally consider to be more attractive host bodies, then why not also kidnap all white people, or East Asians, or Latinos, or anyone else for that matter, especially for the blind art dealer who pointed out the irony of that, by the way, whose only desire was to be able to see. In the film, of course, in direct response to Chris's question, instead of continuing to demonstrate how far from being a matter of hating all niggers, burning crosses and wearing white hoods or swastikas, white supremacy is merely, as the name suggests, keeping white people even just a little bit superior, giving people of colour respect and privileges, of course, and even welcoming them into our homes and families, but only so long as they continue to revere whiteness as the standard, the ideal, and the norm. In short, only so long as white people are the ones who still get to decide who has these privileges and who does not. This entire issue is hand-waved in the film with the claim that being black is now cooler and in vogue, to which I call bullshit, plain and simple, because as the black comedian Chris Rock once put it, there isn't a white man in America who would trade places with him, and he's rich. But even if we can put that massive plot hole aside, the fact still remains that, as I stated earlier, all of the social commentary and insight into racism that had defined the movie up until that point was rendered entirely null and void. As a prime example of this, the revelation that Rose, the protagonist's quote-unquote girlfriend, was a sociopathic siren who had previously pretended to be in love with around a dozen other black men and women in order to lure them to her parents' home, just as she had now lured Chris, including the black man and woman who were now the hosts to her grandmother and grandfather. Leaving aside the fact that I predicted this shocking twist a good 10 minutes before the big reveal, the fact that her realisation earlier in the movie that regardless of how often they would have voted for Obama if they could, her family and their friends, the police and what have you, are all racist, only in a more subtle and nuanced manner, being rendered entirely moot, coupled with the scene in which she's on her laptop hunting for her next victim, as behind her the photos of her previous Black Conquests hang as trophies, while her supposed boyfriend was down in the basement, about to have the higher functions of his brain removed. All of this added to the sense that, like other Blumhouse films I've reviewed in the past, although I know for a fact that it was written by a single person, this movie still feels as if it were inexpertly mashed together from at least two distinct scripts that had been written by entirely different writers with radically different visions. And another example of this dislocation which utterly kills the film for me is the eye-rollingly anticlimactic ending, which, according to another Ouija board message from the Ghost of Watcher Azazel, the creator only tacked on at the last minute as a direct result of his belief that after the election of Trump last year, the original ending was too depressing. So much for artistic integrity and profound social commentary that will last for generations, right? I mean, come on, what was I just saying about no one caring what's actually in the film, least of all the audience, since they'll most likely have forgotten about it within a month anyway? Regardless of what the ending could or should have been, however, having been asked for his ID by the police near the beginning of the film after committing the crime of being a passenger in a road collision while black, accepting the reality that he would always be presumed to be guilty of something simply as a result of being a black man, when the police arrive on the scene to find his girlfriend begging for help, him kneeling over her covered in blood and at least one dead body, you could see the same look of resigned acceptance in his eyes as he raised his hands, waiting to be either in prison for life, if he were lucky, or at worst, shot dead. But no, it wasn't the real police, it was his comic relief friend from the TSA, come to rescue him and tell him, "I done told you not to go to that house." To which they both drive away, leaving 5 dead bodies, one person dying in the middle of the road, one presumably dead in the fire back at the house after being anaesthetised and having the top of his skull removed, at least one black man still trapped in the nightmare state of being a prisoner inside his own body, and all of the inevitable questioning and possible criminal charges utterly ignored, because no different from the ending of Django Unchained, the bad guys are dead, so stop thinking about it and embrace the happy ending like the mindless sheep that you are. So in conclusion then, if Get Out and Split are the two best horror films of the previous 12 months, then that says a hell of a lot more about the genre and the industry as a whole than someone like me ever could.